What good is owning the world if you cannot save your own child? This is a story about a billionaire, a father who discovered that horrible truth, and a black maid with nothing to her name who proved that miracles don't always come from money. They come from courage. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now, let's continue. The phone call came late in the evening. Louis McGee was in his office on the top level of his estate, surrounded by computer screens showing stock tickers moving in real time. His companies were making millions every single second. He owned tech firms, pharmaceutical companies, real estate developments across 3 continents, and more property than some small countries. People called him one of the most powerful billionaires in the nation. When he entered a boardroom, executives stood up. When he made decisions, markets shifted. But that evening, none of it mattered. "Sir, you need to come to the hospital immediately," his assistant's voice trembled through the phone. "It's Allison. The doctors say, you need to come now." Louis's heart stopped. Allison. His 14-year-old daughter. His only child. His everything. He ran faster than he had ever run in his entire life. His luxury vehicle tore through the city streets, the driver breaking every traffic rule, sirens ignored, red lights blown past. When he reached the private medical wing of the hospital, a facility that looked more like a 5-star hotel than a place for the sick, doctors were already gathered. Expensive doctors. The absolute best specialists in the world. Louis had summoned them on private helicopters within the hour, flying them in from different countries. But their faces told him something terrible. Inside the hospital suite, machines beeped in steady, ominous rhythm. Wires and tubes connected to his daughter's fragile body. Allison lay motionless in the bed, her skin pale like winter snow, her lips losing their color. She was only 14 years old. What is wrong with her? Louis grabbed the lead physician by his white coat. "Fix her. I do not care what it costs." The doctors exchanged nervous glances. Finally, Dr. Graves, the renowned neurologist flown in from Geneva, spoke. His voice was tight with professional restraint. "Mr. McGee, your daughter has a rare neurological disease. We have never encountered anything quite like it. It is progressive, aggressive. Her body is shutting down." "Then do something." Louis's voice cracked like thunder. "Give her medicine. Perform surgery. Try experimental treatments. I will pay any amount. Any amount." Dr. Graves swallowed hard. His expression showed the weight of what he had to say next. "Sir, there is no cure. Not yet. We have run every test known to modern medicine. We have consulted specialists from 5 countries. We have tried every treatment protocol available." He paused, the words clearly painful. But what?" Louis's voice broke completely now, the powerful billionaire reduced to a terrified father. "Your daughter has 7 days to live. Perhaps less." The room went completely silent except for the steady beeping of the machines monitoring Allison's failing body. 7 days. 168 hours. And all of Louis McGee's billions, all of his power, all of his influence could not buy a single second more. He collapsed into the chair beside his daughter's bed, took her cold hand in his, and felt his entire world crumble into dust. Earlier that same day, before the phone call that shattered everything, Louis McGee had been a man who believed he controlled the world. His estate sprawled across the hills overlooking the city, a compound of perfectly manicured gardens, marble pathways, and architecture that made magazine covers. Inside his leather-bound office, he had closed a deal worth $500 million with nothing more than his signature on expensive paper. 3 private helicopters had landed on his property that afternoon, bringing medical specialists from Tokyo, London, and Geneva. The finest minds in medicine, summoned at a moment's notice because Louis McGee could afford to move heaven and earth. But Allison had been getting sicker for weeks. It started small. Fatigue. Headaches. Then the tremors in her hands. The difficulty walking. The moments when she would forget simple words or stare blankly as if her mind had traveled somewhere he could not follow. Louis had thrown every resource at the problem. The best doctors ran every test. Advanced imaging, genetic sequencing, experimental diagnostics that were not even approved yet. He paid millions for access to treatments still in clinical trials. Nothing worked. Nothing even slowed it down. His wealth had bought him empires, influence, and respect. It had opened every door, silenced every critic, and built monuments to his success. But it could not buy the one thing that mattered. It could not save his daughter. Now, sitting in that sterile hospital room with machines beeping their terrible countdown, Louis McGee finally understood what it meant to be truly powerless. But Louis McGee was not the only person in that city whose world was about to change forever. Across town, in the small staff quarters of the McGee estate, Rebecca sat on the edge of her narrow bed, washing her uniform by hand in a plastic basin. The water was cold, and her fingers ached from scrubbing, but she did not mind. This was the life she knew, the life she had always known. She had worked at the estate for only 3 weeks, hired as part of the housekeeping staff after moving north from Alabama. The pay was better than anything she could have found back home, and she was grateful for it. Every week, she sent most of her earnings back to her younger siblings. Jamal needed new shoes. Tanya's school fees were due. And Mama's medication was expensive, even with the community helping out. Rebecca folded the damp uniform carefully and hung it over the back of the single chair in her room. The space was tiny, barely large enough for a bed, a small dresser, and that one chair. But it was hers, and it was clean, and she had learned long ago not to need more than that. As she sat back down, her eyes drifted to the worn photograph tucked into the corner of her mirror. Her grandmother, standing in the garden behind their old house in Alabama, surrounded by plants and herbs that grew wild and abundant. Grandma Eunice had been a healer, though she never called herself that. She just said she knew the old ways, the ways the earth provided for those who paid attention. "Baby girl, the earth provides everything we need," her grandmother used to say, her hands deep in the soil, pulling up roots or cutting leaves with practiced precision. "You just have to know where to look and have faith to use it." Rebecca had spent her childhood in that garden, learning the names of plants most people ignored. Wild ginger for nausea, elderberry for fever, yarrow to stop bleeding, and dozens of others, each with its own purpose, its own gift. Her grandmother taught her how to listen to what the body needed, how to see what others overlooked. "Modern doctors got their place," Grandma Eunice would say, grinding dried herbs with her mortar and pestle. "But they forget that healing is older than hospitals, older than pills in bottles. The earth been healing folks long before anybody put on a white coat." Those memories felt distant now, here in this world of marble floors and endless wealth. The McGee estate was like something from a dream, beautiful and cold at the same time. Rebecca cleaned rooms larger than her entire childhood home. She polished silverware worth more than her family made in a year. And she moved through it all quietly, invisibly, the way staff were supposed to. But she kept her grandmother's lessons close to her heart. At night, when the estate was silent and the other staff had gone to their rooms, Rebecca would think about those gardens, about the way healing could come from the simplest things if you just knew where to look. She had no idea that everything she learned in that Alabama garden was about to become the most important knowledge in the world. She had no idea that in just a few hours, she would overhear a conversation that would change not just her life, but the life of a dying girl and her desperate father. She had no idea that courage was about to ask more of her than she ever imagined possible. But the earth, as her grandmother always said, provides what is needed. And sometimes, what is needed is not money or power or influence. Sometimes, what is needed is simply someone brave enough to believe in the impossible. The next morning arrived with cruel indifference to Louis McGee's suffering. Sunlight filtered through the hospital windows, illuminating the sterile room where his daughter fought for every breath. He had not left her side all night. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his tie loosened, his perfectly groomed appearance destroyed by grief and exhaustion. Dr. Graves returned with 3 other specialists, their faces grave as they reviewed charts and conferred in low voices. Louis watched them with hollow eyes, already knowing that nothing they said would bring hope. "Mr. McGee," Dr. Graves finally approached, clipboard in hand. "We have reviewed all the test results again. Consulted with colleagues in 7 different countries overnight. And Lewis's voice was hoarse from hours of silent crying. The doctor's expression said everything before his words did. Your daughter has a rare neurological disease. It is progressive, aggressive, and we have exhausted all treatment options available to modern medicine. Lewis stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. There has to be something. Experimental treatments. Drugs not yet approved. Clinical trials. I will pay for anything. Everything. Sir, we have already tried the experimental protocols. We fast-track treatments that are years away from public approval. We have done things. Dr. Graves paused, choosing his words carefully. Things that pushed every ethical boundary, because we knew you would demand it and because we wanted to save her too. Then try harder. Lewis's voice rose, drawing concerned looks from nurses passing in the hallway. I did not build an empire by accepting defeat. There is always another option. Always. Dr. Graves stepped closer, his voice dropping to something almost gentle. Mr. McGee, I wish that were true. But some things are beyond our control. Beyond anyone's control. Your daughter's condition is deteriorating rapidly. Her body is shutting down, and we cannot stop it. How long? The question came out as barely a whisper. 7 days. Maybe less. The words hit Lewis like physical blows. 7 days. 1 week. 168 hours to watch his daughter fade away while the greatest medical minds in the world stood by, helpless. He collapsed back into the chair beside Allison's bed, reaching for her hand. It felt so small, so fragile in his grip. Her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, each one seeming more labored than the last. The machines beeped their steady rhythm, counting down seconds he could not buy back. Daddy! Allison's voice was barely audible, her eyes fluttering open. I am here, sweetheart. Lewis leaned closer, forcing a smile that felt like shattered glass. I am right here. Am I going to die? Her question was simple, direct, the way children ask about things adults try to hide. Lewis's carefully constructed walls crumbled completely. Tears streamed down his face as he pressed her hand to his cheek. No, baby. No. We are going to find a way. I promise you. But even as he said the words, he knew they were lies. For the first time in his life, Lewis McGee could not keep a promise. For the first time, his power meant nothing. Allison smiled weakly, as if she understood what he could not say. Then her eyes closed again, and she drifted back into the uneasy sleep that had become her only escape from pain. Rebecca arrived at the estate just after dawn, as she did every morning. The bus dropped her at the bottom of the hill, and she walked the long driveway to the staff entrance, her shoes crunching on the perfectly maintained gravel path. The morning air was crisp and cool, and the estate looked even more impressive in the early light, like something from a fairy tale. But today, something felt different. The usual bustle of activity was muted. Gardeners worked in unusual silence. The kitchen staff moved with heavy steps. Even the air seemed weighted with something Rebecca could not name. She collected fresh linens from the supply room and made her way to the main house, her arms full of perfectly folded sheets. Her job was to change the bedding in the guest suites, a task that took most of the morning given how many rooms the estate held. As she approached the study on the second floor, she heard a voice. Lewis McGee's voice, though it sounded nothing like the confident tone she had heard during her brief encounters with him over the past 3 weeks. This voice was broken, raw with anguish. Rebecca knew she should keep walking. Staff were trained to be invisible, to never intrude on the family's privacy. But something made her pause just outside the partially open door. 7 days, Lewis was saying into his phone, his voice cracking on each word. That is what they are giving her. 7 days and my daughter dies. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. Her arms tightened around the linens as if they could somehow anchor her to reality. I do not care about the board meeting, Lewis continued, his voice rising with desperation. I do not care about the merger or the stock prices or any of it. My daughter is dying, and there is nothing I can do. Nothing. Do you understand what that feels like? There was silence. Then a sound that made Rebecca's heart break. Lewis McGee, one of the most powerful men in the country, was sobbing. She moved away quickly, quietly, her mind reeling. Allison, the young girl who had smiled at her in the hallway last week, who had said, "Thank you," when Rebecca held the door for her, who had kind eyes and a gentle voice. That girl was dying. Rebecca made her way back to the staff quarters, the linens forgotten in her arms. She sat on her bed, staring at nothing, her grandmother's photograph catching her eye in the mirror. 7 days. Just like that boy in the old stories Grandma Eunice used to tell. The boy who everyone said would die, until, by afternoon, the news had spread beyond the estate walls. Rebecca was in the staff dining area when Harold, the head gardener, walked in with a newspaper. His weathered face was drawn with sorrow as he laid it on the table. The headline screamed in bold letters, "McGee heiress terminal. Doctors declare case hopeless." The room erupted in whispers. Maria, the head cook, crossed herself and murmured a prayer. Sophie, her assistant, wiped tears from her eyes with her apron. Thomas, the driver who had worked for the McGee family for 15 years, sat heavily in a chair and put his head in his hands. "That poor child," Maria said, her voice thick with emotion. "Only 14 years old. And Mr. McGee. I have never seen a man so broken." "The doctors tried everything," Harold added, his calloused hands gripping the edge of the table. "Flew in specialists from everywhere. Spent millions on treatments. But nothing worked." "Sometimes money cannot buy what matters most," Thomas said quietly. Rebecca listened to them talk, her mind drifting back to her grandmother's garden, to the lessons learned among the herbs and roots, to the stories told on warm summer evenings about healing that came not from hospitals but from the earth itself. A specific memory surfaced, clear as daylight. She was maybe 10 years old, sitting at her grandmother's feet while the old woman ground herbs with her mortar and pestle. "Grandma, can plants really cure anything?" young Rebecca had asked. "Not anything, baby girl. But more than people think." Grandma Eunice had smiled, her hands never stopping their work. "There is one plant, though. Moon's breath, they call it. The rarest healing plant in all creation. Moon's breath. It grows where the earth touches the sky, in the deepest Appalachian mountains. So rare most folks think it is just legend. Glows like captured starlight, they say." Her grandmother's eyes had gone distant, remembering. "My grandmother used it once, long time ago. Saved a dying child when all the doctors had given up. Made that boy well again, like nothing had ever been wrong." "Is it real?" Rebecca had asked, wonder in her voice. "Real as you and me, child. But dangerous to find. The journey has killed people. And even if you survive it, you need faith to use it. Faith that what looks impossible might just be possible after all." Rebecca stood abruptly from the table, startling the others. "Are you all right?" Maria asked, concerned. "Aye." Rebecca paused, her mind racing through calculations, possibilities, impossibilities. 7 days. 3 days to reach the mountains. 1 day to find it. 3 days back. It could work. It had to work. "I need some time alone," she said quietly, and left before anyone could ask questions. In her room, Rebecca pulled out the old journal her grandmother had given her before she died. Pressed between the pages were dried herbs, handwritten notes, and a hand-drawn map. A map showing where the earth touched the sky, where Moon's breath grew. She had thought it was just stories, beautiful legends to comfort a grieving child. But what if it was real? What if her grandmother had been telling the truth? 7 days. A girl dying. And a choice only she could make. Rebecca looked at her grandmother's photograph one more time, and made her decision. She had to try. That night, while the rest of the estate slept, Rebecca made her way to the library. The McGee Estate Library was a room she had cleaned many times but never truly explored. It stretched 2 stories high, with rolling ladders attached to shelves that held thousands of books. Leather-bound volumes, rare editions, collections that would make museums jealous. But tonight, Rebecca was not looking for valuable books. She was searching for truth. She started in the section labeled Regional History and Folklore, her fingers trailing along spines until she found what she needed. Appalachian healing traditions. Mountain medicine, old ways and ancient remedies. The forgotten herbs of the southern highlands. Rebecca pulled them down carefully and spread them across one of the reading tables, her grandmother's journal open beside them. The lamplight cast warm shadows as she began to read, cross-referencing the old books with her grandmother's handwritten notes. There. In a book published in 1887, a single paragraph. Moon's breath, known scientifically as Luminaria celestialis, is perhaps the rarest healing plant in the Appalachian Range. Growing only on specific cliff faces above 4,000 feet, it blooms under conditions still not fully understood by botanists. The moss emits a soft bioluminescent glow and has been credited in folk traditions with miraculous healing properties. However, its remote location and the treacherous terrain required to reach it have made collection extremely dangerous. Several deaths have been documented among those attempting the journey. Rebecca's hands trembled as she turned to her grandmother's journal. The map was there, drawn in faded ink, showing a route through the deepest part of the mountains. Notes in the margins described landmarks. Follow the creek until it splits. Take the eastern branch. Look for the rock formation shaped like a sleeping bear. The cliff face is beyond. She pulled out a modern map from the library's collection and tried to match her grandmother's landmarks to current geography. The location was remote, accessible only by foot once you reached the base of the mountain range. She traced the route with her finger, calculating distances and elevation gains. 3 days to reach it. Maybe 4 if the terrain was as difficult as the books suggested. 1 day to search the cliff face and harvest the moss, if she could find it at all. 3 days back, pushing hard, moving faster than safe. 7 days total. Maybe 8. Allison had 7 days. Maybe less, Dr. Graves had said. The timing was impossibly tight. If anything went wrong, if she got lost or injured, if the weather turned bad, if she could not find the moss, then she would fail. Allison would die, and Rebecca would have risked everything for nothing. But if she did nothing, the outcome was certain. Allison would die anyway. Rebecca stared at the map until her eyes burned, until the lamp oil ran low and dawn began to paint the windows gray. Then she closed the books, folded her grandmother's map carefully, and made her decision. She had to try. The next morning, Rebecca found Maria in the kitchen, preparing breakfast for the staff. The head cook looked up as Rebecca entered, immediately sensing something was wrong. "Child, you look like you have not slept. Come, sit. Let me make you some tea." Rebecca sat at the worn wooden table where staff took their meals. Maria set a steaming cup in front of her, then settled into the chair across with her own cup. The kitchen smelled of fresh bread and coffee, comforting and normal, while Rebecca's mind churned with impossible plans. "Maria, do you believe in folk medicine? Old remedies passed down through families?" Maria's eyebrows rose. "That is a strange question for this early in the morning." "Please, do you believe?" The older woman considered, stirring sugar into her tea. "My mother knew some things. Teas for colds, poultices for cuts. They worked well enough. But nothing serious." "Why?" Rebecca took a breath. "My grandmother was a healer. She taught me about a plant, Moon's breath, that can cure diseases doctors cannot touch. I think it could save Allison." Maria's expression shifted from curiosity to concern. "Rebecca, honey, those are old wives' tales. Stories people tell. The doctors have tried everything. They flew in the best specialists in the world. If they could not help that poor girl, what makes you think some plant from your grandmother's stories could?" "Because my grandmother did not tell stories," Rebecca said firmly. "She told truth." The kitchen door swung open and Harold entered, his boots muddy from the morning's garden work. He caught the tail end of the conversation and stopped, his weathered face thoughtful. "Moon's breath," he said slowly. "My grandmother spoke of it once. Said it was real, not legend, but dangerous." He looked at Rebecca with sudden understanding. "You are thinking of going after it. I have to try." Harold pulled out a chair and sat heavily. "Child, the journey has killed people. Strong men, experienced climbers. The mountains there do not forgive mistakes. If I do nothing, she dies for certain, Rebecca said, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. If I try and fail, the result is the same. But if I try and succeed... She let the possibility hang in the air between them. Maria reached across the table and gripped Rebecca's hand. This is madness. You have worked here 3 weeks. You barely know the girl. I know she is 14 years old and dying. I know she has 7 days. And I know I have a chance to help when no one else can. Rebecca met Maria's eyes. Would not you try if it was your child? The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Each second that passed was one less second Allison had. Thomas appeared in the doorway, his driver's cap in his hands. He had been listening from the hall. How far is this place? Rebecca pulled out the map and spread it on the table. Here. 3 days' journey into the mountains. Thomas studied it, his finger tracing roads and trails. I can drive you to the base. Get you there by afternoon. Save you half a day. Thomas, you do not have to. That girl in the hospital? Thomas's voice was rough with emotion. I drove her to her first day of school. Watched her grow up. If there is any chance at all, we take it. Harold nodded slowly. I will pack provisions. Food that will keep, rope from the garden shed. You will need supplies. Maria stood, her decision made. And I will cover for you with the head housekeeper. Say you had a family emergency. It is not even a lie. Rebecca felt tears prick her eyes. These people, who barely knew her, were willing to risk their jobs to help. Thank you. All of you. Do not thank us yet, Harold said grimly. Just come back alive, child. Before dawn the next morning, Rebecca stood in her small room, packing for the journey. She traveled light because she had to. A sturdy backpack held bottles of water, dried food Maria had prepared, a coil of rope Harold had provided, matches wrapped in waterproof cloth, and a small first aid kit. She wore her sturdiest shoes, layered clothing for changing mountain weather, and carried her grandmother's walking stick, the wood worn smooth by decades of use. She left a brief note for the head housekeeper on her pillow. Family emergency in Alabama. Will return soon. Rebecca. Thomas was waiting by the service entrance, his vehicle running quietly in the pre-dawn darkness. He took her pack and secured it in the back without a word. They drove through empty streets as the city slept, heading toward the mountains that loomed in the distance like sleeping giants. The drive took 4 hours. Thomas navigated highways and then increasingly rough roads until finally, they reached a trailhead where the road ended and wilderness began. He parked and came around to help Rebecca with her pack. You are either very brave or very crazy, he said, adjusting the straps on her shoulders. Rebecca managed a small smile despite her fear. Maybe both. The map shows you returning to this spot in 6 days. I will be here waiting. Every day at sunrise and sunset, I will be here. Thomas's voice was firm. You understand? You are not alone in this. I understand. She turned toward the trail, her grandmother's walking stick in hand. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Somewhere behind her, in a hospital room, Allison McGee was dying. Somewhere ahead, if the old stories were true, was a plant that glowed like captured starlight and could do what modern medicine could not. 7 days. The clock was ticking. While Rebecca took her first steps into the wilderness, miles away in a sterile hospital room, Allison McGee was slipping further from the world. Lewis sat in the same chair he had occupied for 3 days, his hand wrapped around his daughter's. He had not returned to the estate, had not changed clothes or shaved. His assistant brought fresh shirts that hung unused on the back of the bathroom door. Food arrived on trays and grew cold, untouched. Nothing mattered except the girl in the bed, growing weaker with each passing hour. Allison's breathing had changed. Shallow and irregular now, with long pauses that made Lewis's heart stop until the next breath came. Her skin had taken on a translucent quality, blue veins visible beneath the surface like delicate tracings on porcelain. The vibrant girl who had laughed and argued and filled rooms with energy was fading into something fragile and distant. Dad! Her voice was barely a whisper. Lewis leaned closer, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "I am here, baby. Right here. I am scared." The words shattered what remained of his composure. Lewis pressed his forehead against their joined hands, his shoulders shaking. "I know, sweetheart. I am too. Will it hurt? When I—" She could not finish the sentence. "No," Lewis lied, his voice breaking. "No, baby. You will just go to sleep. And I will be right here with you. I promise." Allison's eyes drifted closed again. Lewis watched the monitors, the numbers that had become his entire universe. Heart rate dropping. Blood pressure falling. Oxygen saturation declining. Each metric telling the same story in cold, clinical detail. Dr. Graves entered quietly, reviewed the monitors, and placed a gentle hand on Lewis's shoulder. "Mr. McGee, we need to talk about the next phase." "The next phase?" Lewis looked up, his eyes red and hollow. "Her body is beginning to shut down. We are entering the final phase." The doctor's voice was kind but honest. "Days, not weeks. Perhaps even hours." Lewis nodded numbly. He had known this was coming, had been preparing himself, or trying to. But nothing prepared a father to watch his child die. "We can increase her pain medication. Keep her comfortable." "Do it," Lewis whispered. "Do not let her suffer. Please." After Dr. Graves left, Lewis returned to his vigil. The machines beeped their steady rhythm, counting down seconds he would give anything to stop. Outside the window, the world continued its thoughtless spinning. People went to work, had lunch, complained about traffic. And in this room, his daughter was dying. "Hold on, Allison," he whispered, though he did not know what he was asking her to hold on for. "Please, baby. Just hold on." The forest was denser than any wilderness Rebecca had ever encountered. She pushed through undergrowth that tore at her clothes and scratched her skin. The map showed a trail, but decades of growth had reclaimed it. She had to navigate by landmarks, checking and rechecking her grandmother's notes against the terrain around her. The first hill rose steep and sudden, her legs burning with the effort of climbing. She used the walking stick for balance, her backpack heavy on her shoulders. Sweat soaked through her shirt despite the cool mountain air. When she finally crested the top, she found not flat ground but a descent equally steep into a ravine she had not anticipated. Going down was worse than climbing up. Her feet slipped on loose rocks and wet leaves. Twice she fell, catching herself hard on her palms. But she kept moving, kept pushing forward. Every time her resolve wavered, she thought of Allison. A 14-year-old girl in a hospital bed, running out of time while machines counted down her final hours. By midday, Rebecca reached the creek her grandmother's map mentioned. It should have been a gentle stream. Instead, spring runoff had turned it into a torrent of white water, rushing over rocks with furious speed. She walked along the bank searching for a crossing point, but the creek was wide and deep everywhere. She had already lost hours to the difficult terrain. She could not afford to lose more searching for an easier path. Rebecca found a place where rocks broke the surface, forming a rough path across. She tested the first rock with her walking stick. Slippery but stable. She stepped onto it, arms out for balance, the roar of water filling her ears. Halfway across, her foot slipped. The current grabbed her ankle and pulled. She fell hard, one knee cracking against stone, her backpack suddenly heavy with rushing water. The creek tried to sweep her downstream. She jammed the walking stick between rocks and clung to it, gasping as cold water soaked through her clothes. Using every ounce of strength, Rebecca pulled herself up. Found her footing. Lunged for the next rock, then the next. Her hands were numb with cold by the time she dragged herself onto the far bank, coughing and shivering. She allowed herself 5 minutes to rest, no more. Changed into dry clothes from her pack, wrung out what she could. The sun was already descending toward the western ridgeline. She had to keep moving. That night, Rebecca made camp in a small clearing, her body screaming with exhaustion. Her hands were blistered from gripping the walking stick. Her knee throbbed where she had struck it against the rock. Every muscle ached with a deep, bone-tired pain she had never experienced before. She built a small fire, ate dried meat and hard bread, drank water that tasted of mountain springs. Above her, stars emerged one by one, more stars than she had ever seen in the city. The same stars her grandmother must have seen on her own impossible journeys. "Grandma, if you can hear me, guide me," Rebecca whispered to the darkness. "I do not know if I am strong enough for this. But that girl needs me. So please, help me find the way." The fire crackled. The forest whispered with night sounds. And somewhere far ahead, on a cliff face she had not yet reached, Moon's breath waited. If the stories were true, if she could survive to find it. Dawn came gray and cold, mist clinging to the mountains like cobwebs. Rebecca packed her camp and continued climbing, following the eastern branch of the creek as her grandmother's map instructed. The terrain grew more treacherous with every mile. Steep inclines gave way to rocky scrambles that required both hands to navigate. The forest thinned as altitude increased, replaced by exposed stone and sparse, wind-twisted trees. By noon, the path had narrowed to a ledge barely wide enough for her feet. To her left, the mountain rose sheer and unforgiving. To her right, nothing but air and a drop that made her stomach clench with vertigo. She pressed her back against the rock face and inched sideways, her grandmother's walking stick held in one trembling hand. "Do not look down," she told herself. "Just focus on the next step." Then the next. A section of the ledge crumbled beneath her foot. Rebecca's heart stopped as the rock gave way. She fell sideways, one hand scrabbling at stone, the other instinctively thrusting the walking stick forward. The stick caught in a crack, held. She dangled for a terrible moment, suspended over nothing, her entire weight on that single piece of wood. The walking stick held. Slowly, gasping with effort and terror, Rebecca pulled herself back onto the ledge. Her arm was scraped raw where it had scraped against rock, bleeding through her sleeve. Her hands shook so badly she could barely grip the stone. But she could not stop. Could not go back even if she wanted to. The only way was forward. An hour later, as afternoon shadows lengthened, Rebecca found the cave system her grandmother's notes mentioned. A dark opening in the mountainside, the path disappearing into blackness. She stood at the entrance, every instinct screaming at her to turn back. But Allison did not have time for Rebecca's fear. She pulled out her matches, lit one, and stepped into the darkness. The cave was cold and damp, water dripping somewhere in the distance. The match flame cast wild shadows on stone walls. Rebecca moved carefully, testing each step before committing her weight. The passage narrowed, then widened, then split in two directions. She checked her grandmother's notes by matchlight. Follow the left passage. 30 paces, then right. She counted her steps, lit a new match when the first burned down. The darkness pressed in from all sides, heavy and absolute when the matches died. She rationed them carefully, feeling her way forward in blackness, lighting another only when she reached an intersection or obstacle. Something moved in the darkness ahead. A scraping sound, then a low growl that raised every hair on her body. Rebecca froze, her hand trembling as she lit another match. The tiny flame revealed nothing but empty passage ahead, but the sound came again. Closer now. Some animal had made these caves its home, and she was intruding. She had no weapon except the walking stick. No way to defend herself if something attacked in this confined space. Fear made her breath come in short gasps, but she forced herself to move forward. There was no going back. Only forward, into the dark, toward a dying girl who needed a miracle. The growling faded. Whatever creature shared these caves had decided she was not worth the trouble. Rebecca pressed on, her matches dwindling, her fear a living thing in her chest. After what felt like hours but was probably less than one, she saw light ahead. Faint and gray, but light. The far end of the cave system. She stumbled toward it, emerging into late afternoon sun that felt like salvation. But the journey was far from over. According to her grandmother's map, the cliff face where Moon's breath grew was still another day's climb ahead. And she had just 2 matches left. Rebecca looked up at the mountain peaks still towering above her, then down at her bloodied hands and torn clothes. Every part of her body hurt. She was exhausted, terrified, and the hardest part of the journey still lay ahead. But somewhere behind her, counting down her final hours, a girl named Allison was dying. Rebecca adjusted her pack, gripped her grandmother's walking stick, and kept climbing. Day 3 began with Rebecca's body refusing to cooperate. Every muscle screamed in protest as she forced herself to stand. Her scraped arm had stiffened overnight. The bleeding stopped, but the wound angry and swollen. Blisters on her feet had burst and reformed. Her knee, bruised from the fall in the creek, could barely support her weight. She had eaten the last of her food the night before. Only water remained, and not much of that. But the map showed she was close. One more climb. One final ascent to the cliff face where Moon's breath grew. If it existed at all. Rebecca shook off the doubt and studied the terrain ahead. The mountain rose before her in a nearly vertical wall of gray stone, broken only by narrow ledges and sparse vegetation clinging to impossible angles. This was not a climb for the inexperienced. This was the kind of ascent that killed people. She secured the rope Harold had given her around her waist, tested the knots twice, and began to climb. The first 100 feet were the hardest she had ever experienced. Her fingers found holds in cracks barely wide enough for fingertips. Her boots scraped against stone, seeking purchase on ledges no wider than her hand. The walking stick was strapped to her back now, useless for this vertical climb but too precious to leave behind. Halfway up, her arms began to shake with exhaustion. She pressed her forehead against cold stone, gasping for breath, willing her body to continue. Think of Allison, she told herself. 14 years old. Dying. No time left. She climbed. The sun tracked across the sky as Rebecca inched upward. Twice, handholds crumbled beneath her grip. Once, her foot slipped entirely and she hung by her fingertips alone, scrambling desperately until she found a foothold again. Sweat stung her eyes despite the cold mountain air. Her breath came in ragged gasps that echoed off the stone. Near the top, perhaps 20 feet from the summit, her foot slipped on loose scree. She fell. The rope caught her after a sickening drop of 6 feet, snapping tight around her waist and driving the air from her lungs. She spun in empty space, the ground impossibly far below, her hands grasping at nothing. Panic flooded through her as she swung like a pendulum against the rock face. Control the fear, her grandmother's voice seemed to whisper. Fear makes you stupid. Breathe. Think. Move. Rebecca forced herself to breathe. Located the rock face. Swung her body toward it, caught a ledge with one hand, then the other. Pulled herself close to the stone. Found footholds. Began climbing again, this time with absolute focus born of pure terror. She reached the summit as afternoon light began to fade into evening gold. The top of the cliff opened onto a small plateau, perhaps 30 feet across, with the mountain rising higher beyond. But according to her grandmother's map, she did not need to go higher. The moon's breath grew here, on this specific cliff face, in a protected alcove where conditions aligned in some mysterious way that made the impossible plant thrive. Rebecca moved along the cliff edge, searching. The light was fading fast. If she did not find it before dark, she would have to wait until morning, and morning might be too late. There. A depression in the rock face, barely visible. An alcove carved by wind and time, sheltered from the worst weather, facing east to catch the morning sun. Rebecca approached carefully and looked inside. At first, she saw nothing but shadow. Disappointment crashed over her like a wave. She had come all this way, risked everything, and there was nothing here. Just stone and empty air and her own desperate foolishness. Then the sun dropped another degree toward the horizon, and the angle of light changed. The alcove began to glow. Soft at first, barely visible, like the faintest hint of phosphorescence. Then stronger, pulsing gently with an inner light that had nothing to do with reflected sunshine. Green like new spring leaves, like fireflies on a summer night, like something not quite of this world. Moon's breath. It grew in patches across the back wall of the alcove, moss that shimmered with bioluminescent beauty. Not large patches, perhaps a square foot total, but unmistakably real. Unmistakably alive. Glowing with the same ethereal light her grandmother had described, like captured starlight. Rebecca's legs gave out. She collapsed to her knees, pressing her hands against her mouth to muffle the sobs that tore from her throat. It was real. All the stories, all the old tales, all her grandmother's teachings. Real. She wept with relief and gratitude and exhaustion and wonder. Wept for her grandmother who had known this truth and passed it down. Wept for Allison who might yet live. Wept because she had climbed a mountain and found a miracle. When she could breathe again, Rebecca pulled the small clay jar from her pack. Her grandmother had insisted she bring clay, not glass or plastic. The old medicines need the old containers, she had said. Clay breathes. Keeps things alive. Rebecca carefully scraped the glowing moss from the rock, taking only what she needed and leaving some to continue growing. She worked with reverent hands, placing each piece in the jar until it was half full. The glow intensified inside the sealed container, pulsing like a tiny green heartbeat. She held the jar up to the fading light and whispered, "Thank you, Grandma. Thank you for teaching me. For believing when no one else did." The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Rebecca had found what she came for, but the journey was far from over. She had to get back. Had to reach the hospital before Allison's 7 days ran out. She checked her mental calendar. 3 days to climb up. 1 day spent. That left 3 days to get back, but Allison might not have 3 days left. She would have to move faster. Much faster. Rebecca descended the cliff face in near darkness, taking risks that would have paralyzed her with fear on the way up. She rappelled down sections she had laboriously climbed, the rope burning through her already damaged hands. She did not care. Speed mattered more than safety now. At the bottom, she ran. Through the cave system in pitch darkness, one hand trailing the wall, trusting memory and instinct since her matches were long gone. She stumbled and fell and picked herself up and kept running. Out of the caves and down the mountain paths, her legs carrying her through the night while the clay jar in her pack pulsed with green light. In the darkness before dawn, her foot caught on a root. She fell hard, her head striking a rock. Stars exploded across her vision. When she could see again, everything was blurred, doubled. She touched her forehead and her hand came away sticky with blood. One eye was swelling shut already. Her vision in the other was wrong, fuzzy at the edges. Probably a concussion. Definitely not good. But she could still move, still walk, still carry the precious jar. She walked through day 4, through blinding pain and dizziness, through exhaustion so complete she was no longer sure what was real. The forest blurred around her. Time lost meaning. She was moving, that was all that mattered. Moving toward the trailhead, toward Thomas, toward a girl who needed a miracle. Day 5 came, and Rebecca no longer remembered sleeping. Had she slept? She must have. But there were only fragments now. The creek crossing, somehow easier this time. The ravine. The steep hill. 1 foot in front of the other, the walking stick her only constant companion, her grandmother's wisdom the only thing keeping her upright. The trailhead appeared through the trees like a vision. Thomas's vehicle parked exactly where he had promised. He emerged from the driver's seat as she stumbled into the clearing, his eyes widening in shock at her condition. Rebecca was barely recognizable. Her clothes were torn and filthy. Blood matted her hair from the head wound. One eye was swollen completely shut, the other barely open. She was limping badly, leaving bloody footprints from her destroyed boots. She looked like she had been through a war. But in her hands, clutched against her chest like a sacred object, was a small clay jar that pulsed with soft green light. "Drive fast," Rebecca said, her voice hoarse and cracking. "We are running out of time." Thomas caught her as her legs finally gave out. He helped her into the vehicle, secured the jar carefully, and then did exactly as she asked. He drove fast. 168 hours since Dr. Graves had delivered the diagnosis. 7 days. 1 week. The deadline had arrived. Lewis sat in the chair he had not left for days, holding Allison's hand as he had held it through every endless hour. Her breathing had become so shallow he had to watch her chest carefully to see it rise and fall. The spaces between breaths grew longer, each pause making his heart stop until the next breath came. If it came. The monitors showed numbers that meant nothing good. Heart rate erratic. Blood pressure dropping. oxygen saturation falling despite the tubes delivering pure air into her lungs. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor, her lips nearly colorless. The vibrant girl who had been his entire world was slipping away, and he could do nothing but watch. "I am sorry, baby," Louis whispered, his voice raw from days of crying. "I am so sorry I could not save you." Then the monitors changed their rhythm. The steady beeping became irregular. Fast, then slow, then chaotic. Alarms began to sound. Louis jerked upright, his hand tightening around Allison's as the machines screamed warnings in urgent electronic voices. Medical staff burst through the door. Dr. Graves led them, his face grim as he checked the monitors and then Allison's pulse. Nurses surrounded the bed, hands moving with practiced efficiency, but their expressions told Louis everything he needed to know. "She is crashing," Dr. Graves said, his professional calm cracking. "Get the crash cart." Louis was pushed back as the medical team swarmed around his daughter. They worked with desperate speed, checking lines, adjusting equipment, calling out numbers and medications. But the heart monitor told the story in sound and light. Allison's heartbeat fragmented into chaos. The rhythm broke apart, reformed, broke again. The line on the screen spiked wildly, peaks and valleys that made no sense, the heart trying and failing to maintain its essential pattern. Then it stopped. The line went flat. The monitor emitted a single terrible note that cut through every other sound in the room. That note, steady and unending, was the sound of death. "No," Louis heard himself say, though his voice seemed to come from very far away. "No, no, no." Dr. Graves checked for a pulse at Allison's neck. Checked again. His fingers pressed against her wrist. He looked at the monitors, at the flat line that would not change, at the girl who had stopped breathing. He looked at Louis with devastation in his eyes. "I am calling it," Dr. Graves said quietly. The words fell like stones into still water. "Time of death." He glanced at the clock on the wall. Louis's world ended in that moment. Everything stopped. Sound faded to nothing. Light dimmed. The room, the hospital, the entire universe collapsed down to a single point of unbearable pain. His daughter was dead. His only child. His everything. Gone. He stood on legs that barely held him and moved to the bedside. Pushed past the medical staff. Gathered Allison's still body into his arms, pressing his face against her hair, sobbing with grief so profound it had no words. "Please," he begged, though he did not know who he was begging. "Please, come back. Please." The flat line continued its single, merciless note. Rebecca burst through the hospital's main doors like an avenging spirit. Security guards looked up from their desk, shocked by the apparition that had just entered their clean, orderly space. A woman barely standing, her clothes torn and filthy with mud and blood. One eye swollen completely shut, the other wild with desperation. Her hands clutched a small clay jar that glowed with an impossible green light. "Miss, you cannot." The first guard began, moving to intercept her. Rebecca dodged around him with the last reserves of her strength. "Allison McGee," she gasped. "Where is she?" "Miss, stop." The second guard joined the pursuit. But Rebecca was already running for the stairs, her destroyed boots slapping against polished floors. Pain shot through her injured leg with every step. Her head throbbed where she had struck it. Her vision swam and doubled. But she had not climbed a mountain and survived the impossible to be stopped by hospital security. She took the stairs 2 at a time, using the railing to pull herself upward. The guards followed, shouting for her to stop, but she was driven by something beyond exhaustion or pain. She was driven by purpose. Private wing. 3rd floor. She remembered from the staff gossip, from the whispered conversations about where Mr. McGee had taken his dying daughter. She hit the 3rd floor landing and ran down the corridor, following signs and instinct. Room 307. The door was partially open. She could hear voices inside, hushed and sorrowful. Rebecca pushed through the door and stopped, her heart sinking. The flat-lined single note filled the room. Medical staff stood around the bed in postures of defeat. Dr. Graves had his hand on Louis McGee's shoulder, trying to pull the sobbing man away from his daughter's body. And in the bed, perfectly still, lay Allison. Time of death, 1647, Dr. Graves was saying gently. No! Rebecca's voice cut through the moment like a blade. Everyone turned. Lewis looked up from his daughter's body, his face destroyed by grief. Dr. Graves' expression shifted from sorrow to anger at the interruption. Security, remove this woman. He began. No, Lewis said suddenly. His voice was broken but absolute. Everyone out. Now. Mr. McGee, she is gone. We need to. Out. Lewis's roar shook the room. All of you, get out. Dr. Graves opened his mouth to protest, but something in Lewis's eyes stopped him. The billionaire who had lost everything had nothing left to lose. And in his madness, in his grief, he was willing to try anything. Even the impossible. The medical staff filed out reluctantly, shooting worried glances at Rebecca and Lewis. Dr. Graves was the last to leave, his hand lingering on the door frame. Mr. McGee, please. Do not do this to yourself. Get out, Lewis repeated, quieter now but no less firm. The door closed. Lewis and Rebecca were alone with Allison's body and the terrible flat line that continued to scream. Rebecca stumbled to the bedside, her legs barely holding her. She placed the clay jar on the bedside table with trembling hands and looked at Lewis with her one good eye. Please, she whispered. Let me try. What do you have to lose? Lewis looked at her. Really looked at her for the first time. Saw the desperate state of her, the blood and mud and absolute exhaustion. Saw the glowing jar she had carried. Saw something in her face that might have been faith or might have been madness. Everything was already lost. What did he have to lose indeed? Try, he said. Rebecca's hands shook as she opened the clay jar. Soft green light spilled out, filling the sterile room with an otherworldly glow that pushed back shadows and seemed to make the air itself vibrate with potential. Lewis watched, beyond hope, beyond reason, beyond anything except the desperate need to believe in miracles. Rebecca carefully removed the glowing moss from the jar. It pulsed in her palm like a living heart. She reached for the water pitcher on the bedside table, poured a small amount into a cup, and began to crush the moon's breath between her palms, mixing it with the water. The liquid glowed. It actually glowed, green and luminous and impossible. Come back, baby girl, Rebecca murmured, moving to Allison's side. Lewis stepped back, giving her room. She parted Allison's pale lips gently and let the glowing liquid enter drop by precious drop. Her other hand rested on Allison's cold forehead, the way her grandmother used to do, connecting healer and patient in some way that went beyond medicine. Your daddy needs you, Rebecca continued, her voice soft but urgent. This world needs you. Come back and see real sunrises, not through hospital glass. Come back and live the life you are meant to live. She administered the last drop, closed Allison's lips, kept her hand on the girl's forehead, feeling the terrible coldness there. Silence filled the room. The flat line continued its single, merciless note. Nothing changed. Nothing moved. Lewis felt his last desperate hope crumble into ash. Then Allison's chest hitched. A flutter, barely visible. A cough that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside. The flat line wavered. Broke. A single beep. Then another. Then a rhythm, irregular at first but strengthening. Color seeped back into Allison's lips like ink spreading through water. Pink returned to her cheeks. Her chest began to rise and fall with real breaths, not the shallow gasps of dying but the deep breaths of living. The monitors erupted in beautiful chaos. Heart rate climbing. Blood pressure normalizing. Oxygen saturation rising. Every number moving in the direction of life. Allison's eyes opened. They were unfocused at first, confused, as if she had traveled a great distance and was struggling to remember where she belonged. Then they found her father's face, stunned and disbelieving above her. Dad! Her voice was weak but real. Alive. Unmistakably alive. Lewis made a sound that was half sob, half laugh, completely incoherent. He gathered his daughter into his arms, careful of the tubes and wires, holding her as if she might disappear if he let go. Allison's gaze moved past her father to Rebecca, who stood swaying on her feet, tears streaming down her face from her one good eye. "Who?" Allison began, confused. The door burst open. Dr. Graves rushed in, his face pale with shock. He had heard the monitors from outside, heard the impossible change from death to life. He stopped dead in the doorway, staring at the girl who had been dead moments ago and was now breathing, awake, alive in her father's arms. This is medically impossible," he whispered. Louis looked up at him, then at Rebecca, then back at his daughter. His face was wet with tears, but transformed by wonder and gratitude. "No," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "This is what happens when someone refuses to accept impossible." Rebecca's legs finally gave out completely. She collapsed to the floor, consciousness leaving her, the empty clay jar rolling from her hands. She had climbed a mountain, found a miracle, and delivered it in time. Now, finally, she could rest. The next 5 days transformed everything. Allison's recovery was nothing short of miraculous. Within 24 hours of receiving the moon's breath, her vitals had normalized completely. Within 48 hours, she was sitting up, eating solid food, and asking questions. By the 3rd day, she was walking the hospital corridors with barely any assistance, her strength returning with impossible speed. Dr. Graves ran every test he could conceive. Blood work, brain scans, neurological assessments, genetic sequencing. Every single result came back normal. Not improved. Not healing. Normal. As if the disease that had been systematically destroying her nervous system had simply vanished, leaving no trace it had ever existed. "I have never seen anything like this," Dr. Graves admitted to Louis on the 4th day, holding up charts that made no medical sense. "The disease is gone. Completely. Every marker, every indicator, every trace. Her brain function is perfect. Her motor control is flawless. It is as if she was never sick at all." "How is that possible?" Louis asked, though he already knew the answer had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with a glowing moss from a mountain cliff. "It is not possible. According to everything I know, everything medical science understands, this should not have happened." Dr. Graves looked at Louis with something between awe and frustration. "Whatever was in that jar your maid brought, it did something we cannot explain. The medical community will want to study it, to understand it, to replicate it." But the jar was empty, the last traces of Moon's breath used to save Allison's life. And Rebecca, recovering in her own hospital room from exhaustion, dehydration, a concussion, and various injuries, was not talking about where she had found it. By the 5th day, the news had spread beyond the hospital walls. Journalists camped outside, demanding statements. The headline screamed from every newspaper and news website, "Miracle recovery for McGee heiress. Billionaire's daughter defies death sentence." The medical establishment wanted answers. Pharmaceutical companies called offering ridiculous sums for information about the cure. Research institutions demanded samples. But Louis McGee, who had spent his life making deals and accumulating wealth, found himself protecting something that could not be bought or sold. He went to Rebecca's hospital room, where she sat propped against pillows, her head still bandaged, her injured eye finally able to open though ringed with spectacular bruises. "You saved my daughter's life," Louis said without preamble. "Name your price. Anything. A house. A fortune. Education. Whatever you want, it is yours." Rebecca looked at him with quiet dignity. "I do not want your money, Mr. McGee." "Then what do you want?" She was silent for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "I want to stay. To help Allison recover fully. To make sure she is really well." Louis felt something crack open in his chest. This woman who had risked everything, who had nearly died to save a girl she barely knew, wanted nothing except to continue helping. "You will stay," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Not as staff. As family. I am giving you a suite in the family wing. You are part of this household now. Part of this family." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you." "No," Louis said firmly. "Thank you. You gave me back everything that matters." Across the city, in an office building of steel and glass, Damien Locke stared at the newspaper headline with barely controlled rage. He was a man built from ambition and ruthlessness, with a face that had been called handsome and cold in equal measure. He had spent 3 years positioning himself to acquire McGee's empire. 3 years of careful maneuvering, strategic investments, and patient waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment should have been now. With Louis McGee broken by grief, distracted by his daughter's death, vulnerable and weak, the board would have turned against him. Shareholders would have demanded changes, and Damien would have swept in with his hostile takeover, acquiring everything Louis had built for a fraction of its worth. He had been so close. Louis McGee's empire, his pharmaceutical companies with their patents and research divisions, his tech firms with their cutting-edge developments, all of it within reach. Billions of dollars, a century of influence, his for the taking. But the girl had not died. Against every medical prediction, against all logic and reason, she had recovered. And now Louis McGee was stronger than ever, bolstered by gratitude and renewed purpose, untouchable in the public eye. Damien's carefully constructed plan had crumbled into nothing. He pressed the intercom on his desk. "Get me Kovac." 5 minutes later, a man entered who looked like he had been assembled from spare parts. Scarred face, cold eyes, the bearing of someone intimately familiar with violence. Victor Kovac ran the kind of operation that existed in shadows, providing services no legitimate business would advertise. "Mr. Locke," Kovac said, his accent thick and Eastern European. "There is a girl at the McGee estate, 14 years old, just released from the hospital, and a maid, mid-20s, who brought her some kind of cure." Damien slid a folder across his desk containing photographs and information his sources had gathered. "I need them both eliminated. Tonight." Kovac flipped through the folder without expression. "The estate has security. Make it look like a robbery. Break-ins happen, even in the best neighborhoods." Damien's voice was flat, businesslike, as if he were discussing a corporate acquisition rather than murder. "The girl dies, the maid dies, and any trace of that cure is destroyed. No survivors. No evidence. Can you handle it?" Kovac smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "I will need 5 men. 20,000 each, half now, half on completion." "Done. But it has to be tonight, before McGee moves them somewhere I cannot reach." "Tonight," Kovac confirmed. He pocketed the folder and left without another word. Damien turned back to the window, looking out over the city. Sometimes, when legal avenues failed, other methods became necessary. He had not built his fortune by accepting defeat. If Louis McGee would not fall through business means, then he would fall through tragedy. A home invasion. A terrible accident. These things happened, even to billionaires. And when the dust settled, when Louis was broken by the loss of his daughter a second time, Damien would be there to pick up the pieces of his empire. That evening, the McGee estate was transformed by joy. Every room glowed with warm light. The staff had worked all day preparing a celebration for Allison's homecoming. Maria had cooked enough food for twice their number. Harold had filled the house with flowers from his gardens. Sophie had baked 3 cakes. The entire household gathered in the main dining room, a space usually reserved for formal dinners, now filled with genuine happiness. Allison sat at the head of the table beside her father, wearing comfortable clothes instead of a hospital gown, her color healthy and her smile radiant. She looked like the girl she had been before the sickness, full of energy and life. Rebecca sat to her other side, still moving carefully because of her injuries but present, dressed in clothes Allison had insisted she accept. Not a uniform. Real clothes, because she was no longer staff. She was family. A toast. Louis stood, raising his glass. Everyone followed suit. To Rebecca, who did the impossible, who refused to accept defeat when everyone else had given up, who brought my daughter back from death itself. To Rebecca, everyone chorused. Rebecca's face flushed with embarrassment and gratitude. Harold raised his glass to her. Maria blew her a kiss. Thomas nodded with deep respect. Sophie and the other staff members applauded. Then Allison stood, a bit unsteady but determined. She moved to Rebecca and wrapped her arms around her in a fierce hug. "You saved my life," Allison said, her voice thick with emotion. You are family now. You are always going to be family." Rebecca hugged her back, careful of her own injuries, and let tears fall freely. "I would do it again," she whispered. 1,000 times over. Louis cleared his throat, emotion making his voice rough. "I have made a decision. I am establishing a foundation for traditional medicine research. To preserve the kind of knowledge Rebecca carries. To honor healing practices that modern medicine has forgotten or dismissed." He looked at Rebecca. "And I want you to help lead it." The room erupted in applause. Rebecca could only nod, overwhelmed by the transformation her life had taken. A week ago, she had been a maid washing uniforms by hand. Now she was part of a family, entrusted with preserving her grandmother's legacy on a scale she had never imagined possible. The celebration continued into the evening. Food was served and consumed with genuine appetite. Stories were told. Laughter filled rooms that had been silent with grief for too long. The household staff, usually separated from the family by walls of protocol and class, sat together as equals bound by shared joy. As midnight approached, Allison was telling a story about her first day of school, making everyone laugh with her animated gestures. Louis watched his daughter with eyes that saw a miracle every time she moved, every time she smiled. Then the lights went out. Complete darkness. So sudden, it stopped conversations mid-sentence. For a moment, there was only confused silence. Then came the sound of shattering glass. Glass exploded inward from multiple windows simultaneously. Tactical flashlights cut through the darkness like blades, sweeping across walls and furniture with military precision. Through the shattered windows came 5 figures dressed in black, faces covered by masks, moving with the coordinated efficiency of trained soldiers. They were not here to rob. They were here to kill. Louis reacted on instinct, pushing Allison behind him as his eyes adjusted to the darkness. "Everyone down!" he shouted, but his voice was lost in the chaos of screaming and breaking furniture as people dove for cover. The intruders moved through the ground floor like a precision strike team. 2 headed for the stairs immediately, their target obvious. 3 engaged Louis's personal security team in the foyer, and the security guards never stood a chance. These were not ordinary criminals. These were professionals. 1 guard went down with a brutal strike to the throat. Another was disarmed and dropped with ruthless efficiency. The 3rd managed to activate the silent alarm before he too was neutralized. Red lights began flashing throughout the estate, but the intruders did not pause. They had planned for this, timed it perfectly. The 2 heading for the stairs encountered Louis, who placed himself in their path with nothing but desperate courage. 1 intruder swept his legs out from under him. Louis hit the marble floor hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs. A boot pressed down on his chest, pinning him. "Where is the girl?" a voice demanded, cold and accented. Louis tried to answer, tried to plead, but he could not breathe. The boot pressed harder. Upstairs, Rebecca had grabbed Allison the moment the lights failed. Years of living cautiously, of being alert to danger, had given her instincts that rich people never developed. She had pulled Allison toward the stairs, planning to get her to safety, but the sound of breaking glass and combat below made her reverse course. They ran to Allison's bedroom. Rebecca shoved the heavy dresser against the door, her injuries screaming in protest. A chair followed, then the desk. She grabbed her grandmother's walking stick, the one that had carried her up a mountain, and turned to face the door. "Get in the bathroom," she told Allison. "Lock the door. Do not come out for anyone except me or your father. Rebecca, what is happening? Go. Now." Allison ran for the bathroom. Rebecca heard the lock click just as heavy footsteps thundered up the stairs. Voices shouted in a language she did not recognize. Then the doorknob rattled. "Open the door," a voice commanded. Rebecca said nothing, just gripped the walking stick and waited. The door exploded inward. The flimsy barricade she had constructed slowed them for perhaps 5 seconds. The dresser toppled. The chair splintered. A masked figure stepped through the wreckage, weapon raised, tactical light mounted to it, sweeping the room until it found her. "Where is the girl?" Rebecca raised the walking stick. It looked pathetic against the intruder's weapon, a piece of wood against modern violence. But it was her grandmother's stick. It had carried her through impossible terrain. It had saved her life on a crumbling cliff. It was all she had. "You will have to go through me," she said quietly. The intruder laughed and stepped forward. Then Maria hit him with a vase. The head cook had been hiding in the hallway when the intruders passed. She was 63 years old, soft around the middle from decades of tasting her own cooking, with hands scarred from kitchen burns and arthritic joints that ached in cold weather. She had no business fighting trained mercenaries. But this was her household, her family, and no one was going to hurt them while she drew breath. The vase was an antique worth thousands of dollars. It shattered beautifully across the back of the intruder's head. He dropped like a stone, his weapon clattering across the floor. Maria stood over him, breathing hard, holding the broken neck of the vase like a club. "Touch that girl and I will end you," she hissed. The commotion had roused the rest of the household. The celebration had scattered people throughout the house, and now they emerged from hiding spots with whatever they could find as weapons. Harold appeared at the top of the stairs wielding his gardening shovel, the same one he used to turn soil and plant flowers. He was 72 years old with arthritis that made his hands shake, but he had worked hard labor his entire life, and there was still strength in those old arms. He swung the shovel at the second intruder coming up the stairs, catching him in the shoulder with enough force to send him tumbling backward. Sophie came from the kitchen wing holding the massive cast-iron skillet she used to make breakfast every morning. It weighed 10 pounds, and she wielded it like a medieval mace. She caught an intruder in the ribs, then brought it around for a backswing that connected with his masked face. Thomas, the soft-spoken driver who had never raised his voice in 15 years of service, roared like a lion as he tackled an intruder twice his size. They went down in a tangle of limbs, rolling across the marble floor, and Thomas fought with the desperate strength of a man protecting his family. More staff poured in from every direction. The night groundskeeper with his pruning shears, 2 maids wielding heavy candlesticks, the assistant cook with a meat cleaver. Even the night guard's wife, who lived in a cottage on the property, came running with a fireplace poker. The intruders had trained for many scenarios: home invasions, security forces, alarm systems. But they had not trained for this. They had not expected an army of cooks, gardeners, drivers, and maids fighting with kitchen implements and gardening tools, fighting with absolute conviction because they were protecting something that mattered more than their own safety. The staircase became a battleground. Harold swung his shovel again and again, his old body remembering the strength of youth. An intruder tried to grab it from him, but the gardener held on with stubborn determination born from decades of physical labor. They struggled, and then Harold brought his knee up hard, and the intruder folded. Sophie's skillet rang like a bell each time it connected with flesh or bone. She moved with surprising speed for a woman her size, each swing purposeful and devastating. An intruder tried to point his weapon at her, but Thomas appeared from the side, slamming into him, and they crashed through a decorative table. Maria coordinated the defense like a general, shouting orders while wielding her broken vase. "Watch your left! Behind you! Together now!" The mercenaries were trained professionals, but they were being overwhelmed by sheer numbers and unexpected ferocity. What should have been a quick, clean operation had devolved into chaotic close-quarters combat against opponents who fought like cornered animals protecting their young. One intruder made it past the melee and reached the upstairs hallway. He moved toward Allison's room with single-minded purpose, stepping over his fallen comrade, his weapon sweeping for targets. He reached the shattered door and saw Rebecca standing there, alone, with nothing but a walking stick. "Easy target." Rebecca raised the stick, and the intruder laughed again. But his laughter died when he saw she was not alone anymore. Lewis appeared beside her, his face bruised from where he had been struck but his eyes burning with protective fury. Then Harold, breathing hard and bleeding from a cut on his forehead but still gripping his shovel. Then Maria, and Sophie, and Thomas. Then more staff, a dozen strong, filling the hallway like a human wall. They were gardeners and cooks and drivers and maids. They were not trained fighters. But they had found something worth fighting for, and they would not back down. The intruder's weapon swept across the assembled group. So many targets, but also so many witnesses. So many people who would have to be eliminated to complete the mission. His tactical assessment, running in the back of his trained mind, calculated odds and came up with unacceptable numbers. "This is not worth it," he said to his team through his communication device. Sirens filled the night. The silent alarm had brought police, and they were close now, perhaps seconds away. The mission had failed. Time to extract. The intruder lowered his weapon slowly and raised his hands. In the foyer, his remaining conscious teammates did the same. The cost-benefit analysis was clear. They could not win, and dying here served no purpose. The police burst through the front door with weapons drawn and lights blazing. They found a scene of chaos. Injured security guards. Shattered glass and broken furniture. 5 intruders in tactical gear being held at bay by an unlikely army of household staff armed with kitchen implements and gardening tools. The mercenaries were taken into custody without resistance. Professional enough to know when to surrender. Their masks were removed, revealing hard faces that belonged to men who killed for money. In the cleanup that followed, detectives found more than they expected. One intruder's phone contained encrypted messages. Another had a contract with specific targets listed: Allison McGee and Rebecca Johnson. Wire transfers in offshore accounts. And a name that kept appearing in the communications: Locke. Detective Sarah Chen, lead investigator on the scene, held up a phone showing a message thread. "Mr. McGee, do you know anyone named Damien Locke?" Lewis, sitting on the stairs with his arm around Allison while paramedics checked them both, felt ice form in his stomach. "He is a business rival. We have had conflicts." "I think we need to have a longer conversation about those conflicts," Detective Chen said, her expression grim. "Because these men were hired to kill your daughter and Ms. Johnson. And the evidence points directly to Mr. Locke." Lewis looked at the assembled household staff, at these ordinary people who had become extraordinary when it mattered most. Maria with her broken vase. Harold with his dented shovel. Sophie with her skillet. Thomas with his bruised knuckles. All of them had risked everything to protect his daughter and Rebecca. Money had not saved his daughter. Doctors had not saved his daughter. Power and influence had not saved his daughter. But courage had. Love had. Loyalty had. These people, who worked for wages he barely noticed in his accounts, had proven that the things that truly mattered could not be bought. They had to be earned, nurtured, and when necessary, fought for. "Thank you," Lewis said, his voice breaking. "All of you. Thank you." Harold just nodded, leaning heavily on his shovel. "That is what family does, Mr. McGee. We protect each other." And for the first time in his life, Lewis McGee truly understood what wealth meant. The arrest came 3 days after the attack. Federal agents surrounded Damien Locke's office building at dawn, blocking every exit. When they entered his corner office with its views of the city and its art worth millions, they found him at his desk as if it were just another business day. He did not resist. Men like Damien Locke understood when the game was over. The evidence was overwhelming. Wire transfers to offshore accounts. Encrypted messages ordering the hit. Communications with Victor Kovac detailing the plan to eliminate Allison and Rebecca. The mercenaries, facing long prison sentences, had cooperated fully in exchange for reduced charges. They had given investigators everything. The federal investigation revealed more than just attempted murder. Years of corporate espionage, illegal stock manipulation, bribery of public officials. Damien Locke had built his empire on a foundation of crimes that were now coming to light. What began as an investigation into a home invasion had uncovered a conspiracy that reached into boardrooms and government offices. Lewis testified at the grand jury hearing, his voice steady as he described how Damien had needed him broken and vulnerable, had been positioning himself for a hostile takeover, had seen his daughter's death as a business opportunity. The jury listened in stunned silence. The indictments that followed would put Damien Locke away for the rest of his life. But Lewis found he cared less about revenge than he had expected. Justice mattered, but it was not what occupied his thoughts anymore. The attempt on their lives had transformed the McGee household in ways he was still discovering. The walls that had separated employer from employee, family from staff, had crumbled completely that night. They had fought together, bled together, protected each other with absolute conviction. You could not go through something like that and return to polite distance and professional boundaries. Harold no longer knocked before entering rooms. He just walked in, usually with flowers or vegetables from his garden, and sat down to talk. Maria had taken over meal planning for the entire household, and her dinners had become family gatherings where everyone ate together. Sophie sang while she worked, her voice carrying through halls that had once been silent with formality. Thomas had moved from the driver's quarters into a proper room in the main house because Louis had insisted, and now he joined them for evening card games. Allison recovered fully, her strength returning day by day until she was the vibrant, energetic girl she had been before the illness. But she was different too, changed by her journey to the edge of death and back. She carried a quiet wisdom now, an appreciation for life that most 14-year-olds never developed. And Rebecca had become the sister Allison never had. 2 weeks after the attack, Rebecca's siblings arrived from Alabama. Jamal was 12, tall and shy with questions about everything. Tanya was 9, bright-eyed and chattering constantly. They had traveled by bus, their first time leaving their home state, overwhelmed by the estate and the city and the sudden change in their sister's circumstances. Louis had arranged everything, had insisted they visit, had given them rooms near Rebecca's suite. Watching Allison and Rebecca's siblings play in the garden, hearing their laughter echo through rooms that had been silent too long, he understood what he had been missing all these years. The estate felt different now. Warmer, lived in, filled with life and laughter and the beautiful chaos of people who cared about each other. The cold marble had been softened with rugs and cushions. Family photos appeared on walls that had held only expensive art. Children's drawings were stuck to the refrigerator. This was what a home was supposed to be. 3 months later, the McGee Foundation for Indigenous Healing opened its doors. The building was beautiful but purposefully designed, blending modern architecture with natural elements. Large windows let in sunlight. Gardens surrounded the structure, planted with medicinal herbs from cultures around the world. Inside were research laboratories next to traditional healing spaces, libraries filled with both scientific journals and ancient texts, classrooms where knowledge could be shared and preserved. Louis had restructured his entire business philosophy to fund it. He had stepped back from the relentless pursuit of profit above all else, had delegated more, had chosen people over margins. The foundation was not about making money. It was about preserving wisdom that modern society had nearly lost. Profit still mattered. His companies still operated, still generated wealth. But now that wealth served a purpose beyond accumulation. Rebecca and Allison worked together every day at the foundation, an unlikely partnership that somehow made perfect sense. Allison, with her sharp mind and natural leadership, handled the organizational side. Rebecca, with her grandmother's knowledge and genuine humility, led the research and documentation efforts. They had created extensive gardens where medicinal plants grew, each one labeled with its traditional name, scientific classification, and healing properties. Libraries housed volumes on folk medicine from every culture, books that were being digitized and preserved. Research facilities allowed scientists to study traditional remedies with modern techniques, not to dismiss them but to understand why they worked. Traditional healers from around the world had been invited to share their knowledge. Curanders from Mexico, medicine men from Native American tribes, herbalists from China, shamans from the Amazon. Healers whose knowledge had been passed down through generations were finally being respected, honored, and given resources to continue their work. The opening ceremony drew massive crowds. Media from around the world. Medical professionals curious about this blending of traditional and modern. Community members who had always known their grandmother's remedies worked but had never seen them taken seriously. Louis stood at the podium, looking out at the assembled crowd, feeling the weight of what this moment meant. Allison stood to his right, healthy and radiant in a simple dress. Rebecca stood to his left, no longer wearing a maid's uniform but clothes chosen by Allison, looking uncomfortable with the attention but standing straight and proud. 3 months ago, my daughter was dying, Louis began, his voice carrying across the crowd. The best doctors in the world could not save her. I spent millions on treatments, flew in specialists from 5 countries, used every connection, every resource, every ounce of power I had accumulated over decades of building my empire. He paused, letting the silence settle. None of it mattered. Money bought me nothing but despair. Power gave me nothing but helplessness. I watched my daughter slip away and knew that everything I had built was worthless. Louis turned to look at Rebecca, his voice thick with emotion. Then a woman who earned minimum wage, who owned nothing but courage and the wisdom passed down from her grandmother, did what I could not. She saved my daughter not with wealth, but with wisdom. Not with power, but with purpose. She climbed a mountain, risked her life, and brought back a miracle that modern medicine did not know existed. The crowd murmured, many hearing this part of the story in detail for the first time. I thought wealth meant control, Louis continued. I thought money could solve anything. I was wrong. True wealth is not in bank accounts. It is in knowledge preserved, in courage demonstrated, in love expressed through action. This foundation exists because a woman refused to accept defeat. Because she believed in healing that comes from the earth and the wisdom of those who understand it. He gestured to the building behind him, to the gardens, to everything they had created. We are here to honor that wisdom, to preserve it, to ensure that no one else loses what I nearly lost because we dismissed knowledge that did not come from laboratories or medical schools. Traditional healers are not relics of the past. They are guardians of truth we have forgotten. The applause was thunderous. Louis stepped back from the podium as Rebecca and Allison cut the ceremonial ribbon. Cameras flashed. The crowd surged forward to tour the facilities. The headline the next day read, McGee pledges billions to traditional medicine research. Credits Maid who saved his daughter's life. But Louis barely noticed. He had stopped caring what headlines said about him. That evening, the family gathered for dinner at the estate. Not a formal affair. Just family. Harold came in from the garden with dirt under his fingernails and a basket of fresh vegetables. Maria had spent the afternoon cooking her famous recipes, the kitchen filled with aromas that made everyone's mouth water. Sophie brought out fresh bread and butter. Thomas set the table, not because it was his job but because he wanted to help. Allison sat between her father and Rebecca, who she introduced to everyone now as Aunt Becca. Rebecca's siblings were there too, Jamal asking Louis about business while Tanya showed Allison drawings she had made. The night guard and his wife joined them, as did several other staff members who were no longer staff but family. They ate and laughed and told stories. Harold recounted the night of the attack, how he had swung his shovel like a warrior. Maria demonstrated her vase technique to much laughter. Thomas admitted he had been terrified but could not let that stop him. Allison was planning her future out loud. She wanted to study medicine and botany, to understand both traditional and modern healing. I want to build bridges, she said, her eyes bright with passion. Connect what Aunt Becca knows with what doctors know. There is wisdom in both. Rebecca listened with pride, thinking about her grandmother. She could almost hear the old woman's voice. Baby girl, healing does not come from having everything. It comes from giving everything you have. She had given everything she had. Her safety, her strength, nearly her life. And in return, she had received more than she ever imagined. A family. A purpose. A chance to honor her grandmother's legacy in ways that would reach far beyond one dying girl. Louis watched his daughter, healthy and vibrant, planning a future he had thought she would never have. He watched Rebecca, who had given him back his world. He watched his household, this collection of ordinary people who had proven themselves extraordinary when it mattered most. True wealth was never in the bank, he understood now. It was always in each other. Miracles were born when someone refused to accept defeat. When courage met compassion. When the human heart proved stronger than any disease, any wealth, any darkness. As sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and purple, the estate glowed with warm light from every window. Family was visible through the glass, gathered together, laughing and alive. The cold marble mansion had been transformed into a home that pulsed with life and love. And in the garden, carefully tended in a special greenhouse, Rebecca had planted samples of moon's breath. It grew slowly, glowing softly in the gathering dusk, a living reminder that miracles existed for those brave enough to seek them. The knowledge would not be hoarded. It would be studied, understood, and shared with the world, so that no other father would have to watch his child die. so that no other family would lose hope when modern medicine reached its limits. The impossible had become possible, and that possibility would spread, like light pushing back darkness, one healing at a time. In the dining room, someone started laughing. Someone else joined in. The sound carried through open windows into the evening air, a sound of pure joy from people who had learned what truly mattered. Not money, not power, not empires or headlines or bank accounts. Just each other. Just love. Just the courage to believe that impossible things could happen when ordinary people refused to give up. That was wealth. That was everything. That was home. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this incredible journey. If this story touched your heart, wait until you see what's coming next. It's even more powerful and inspiring than you can imagine. So don't go anywhere. Click on that video showing on your screen right now to dive into another amazing story that will absolutely blow your mind. Trust me, you won't regret it.